In the annals of human cruelty, there exist punishments so barbaric that even hardened historians struggle to comprehend their reality. Among these stands a torture method that transformed a simple wooden beam into an instrument of unimaginable agony. They called it riding the rail, and for those who endured it, death would have been a mercy. This is not merely a tale of physical torment, but a window into the darkest capabilities of human imagination when given the power to punish. What you are about to learn may disturb you, but it is a story that demands to be told, for in understanding our capacity for cruelty, we might better guard against its return. The year is 1863, and the American Civil War rages across a divided nation. In a Union Army camp near Petersburg, Virginia, a soldier accused of desertion is dragged before his commanding officers. His sentence will not be death by firing squad, nor imprisonment in the stockades. Instead, he faces something far worse, a punishment that will leave him begging for the bullet he might have received. As his fellow soldiers are forced to watch, rough hands lift him onto a narrow wooden rail, barely wider than a fence post. Within minutes, his screams pierce the morning air, a sound that will haunt every witness for the rest of their lives. But the Civil War camps were not the birthplace of this torture. The practice of forcing victims to straddle sharp wooden beams traces back through centuries of human conflict and judicial punishment. Medieval European communities employed similar methods during witch trials, where accused women were made to sit on sharp-edged wooden triangles as a test of their supposed supernatural powers. The Spanish Inquisition refined the technique, adding weights to the victim's ankles to increase the pressure and accelerate the damage to flesh and bone. In colonial America, the punishment found new life as a tool of mob justice, particularly in frontier towns where formal law enforcement was scarce or non-existent. The mechanics of riding the rail were devastatingly simple, yet their effects on the human body were catastrophically complex. The victim was lifted onto a narrow wooden beam, typically a fence rail or a specially constructed sawhorse with its upper edge honed to a sharp angle. The width of the beam varied, but most were between 2 and 4 inches across at the top, tapering to an edge that could be as narrow as half an inch. The victim's full body weight would rest entirely on this edge, concentrated on the soft tissue of the perineum and inner thighs. Within moments, the pressure would begin cutting off blood flow to the lower extremities, while simultaneously crushing delicate nerves and blood vessels. The positioning of the victim was crucial to maximizing suffering while preventing quick death. The rail was typically set at a height that forced the victim to remain on their toes if they wished to relieve any pressure. This created an impossible choice: bear the full weight on the rail or exhaust the leg muscles trying to lift oneself up. Guards would sometimes tie the victim's hands behind their back or above their head, eliminating any possibility of using arm strength for relief. In some documented cases, ankle weights were added incrementally, increasing the downward force hour by hour. The most sadistic variations included coating the rail with irritants like salt or turpentine, which would seep into the wounds as they formed. The physical progression of injury followed a horrifying pattern that medical observers of the era documented with clinical detachment. First came the bruising and swelling as blood vessels burst under pressure. Within an hour, the skin would begin to split, creating deep lacerations that extended along the contact points with the rail. The victim's legs would gradually lose feeling as nerves were crushed and blood flow was restricted. After several hours, tissue death would begin, leading to permanent damage to muscles and organs. Many victims lost consciousness repeatedly, only to be revived with cold water and forced to continue their ordeal. The human body's remarkable ability to endure pain became, in this context, a curse rather than a blessing. Contemporary medical understanding reveals the true scope of damage inflicted by this punishment. The perineum, where most pressure was concentrated, contains crucial nerves including the pudendal nerve, which controls sensation and function in the pelvic region. Prolonged compression of this nerve leads to permanent loss of bladder and bowel control, sexual dysfunction, and chronic pain syndromes that no amount of medical intervention could remedy. The femoral arteries and veins running through the inner thighs would be compressed to the point of causing deep vein thrombosis, potentially leading to fatal pulmonary embolisms days or weeks after the punishment ended. Modern physicians studying historical accounts have identified symptoms consistent with compartment syndrome, rhabdomyolysis, and severe psychological trauma comparable to that seen in torture survivors. The psychological warfare embedded in riding the rail extended far beyond physical pain. The public nature of the punishment was deliberately orchestrated to maximize humiliation and serve as a deterrent to others. Victims were often stripped partially or completely naked, their dignity destroyed along with their bodies. The gradual nature of the injury meant that victims remained conscious and aware of their progressive destruction, experiencing not just pain, but the terror of permanent disability. Witnesses reported that many victims begged for death, promising anything to anyone who would end their suffering. The sound of their pleas, growing weaker as hours passed, created an atmosphere of dread that infected entire communities. During the American Civil War, riding the rail reached its most systematic and widespread application within military contexts. Both Union and Confederate forces employed the punishment, though records suggest it was more common in volunteer regiments where discipline was harder to maintain than in regular army units. The practice was officially prohibited by military regulations, but enforcement of these rules varied wildly depending on the commanding officers and the remoteness of the camp. In his memoirs, Union soldier James Madison Stone described witnessing the punishment at Camp Chase in Ohio, writing that the most hardened men among us wept openly at the sight, and several fainted dead away from the horror of it. The selection of victims followed patterns that revealed the deeper social dynamics at play within military units. New recruits, particularly those from immigrant communities, were disproportionately subjected to this punishment. Irish and German soldiers in the Union Army reported higher rates of rail riding sentences for offenses that might earn native-born Americans only minor disciplinary action. The punishment was also weaponized against soldiers who were seen as troublemakers or who questioned authority too openly. In Confederate camps, the practice took on racial dimensions, with captured black Union soldiers and Confederate deserters from poor white backgrounds most likely to face the rail. Military surgeons who treated victims afterward left detailed records of the injuries they observed. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, documented cases where soldiers required months of medical care after just a few hours on the rail. He noted that many never recovered full mobility, suffering from permanent limps, chronic pain, and inability to sit normally. The psychological effects were equally severe, with victims showing symptoms we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some became withdrawn and unable to function in military service, while others developed violent tendencies, turning their rage against fellow soldiers or civilians. The economic and logistical burden of caring for rail-riding victims eventually contributed to the punishment's decline in military settings. Commanders realized that permanently disabling their own soldiers was counterproductive to the war effort. A soldier who might have been reformed through less severe punishment was instead transformed into a medical burden requiring constant care and unable to contribute to the fight. By 1864, several high-ranking officers had issued orders explicitly forbidding the practice, though enforcement remained inconsistent. General William Tecumseh Sherman reportedly court-martialed an officer who had ordered rail riding, stating that such barbarism has no place in a civilized army. Mathi. The testimonies of survivors provide the most harrowing insights into the experience. Private Michael O'Sullivan of the 69th New York Infantry, who endured 4 hours on the rail for alleged theft, later testified before a military commission about his ordeal. He described how the pain began as a sharp cutting sensation, but evolved into something beyond description, as if my very soul was being split in two. O'Sullivan never fully recovered, walking with crutches for the rest of his life and suffering from chronic infections in the scarred tissue. His testimony helped bring about stricter enforcement of regulations against the practice, though it came too late for hundreds of other victims. Women were not exempt from this torture, though their experiences were often erased from official records due to the sexual nature of the injuries inflicted. In frontier communities, women accused of prostitution, adultery, or other moral crimes were sometimes subjected to rail riding as a form of gendered punishment. The few documented accounts that survive suggest that the torture was modified to maximize both physical pain and sexual humiliation. Women victims faced additional medical complications, including severe gynecological injuries that could result in infertility, chronic infections, and death from sepsis. The shame associated with these injuries meant that many women never sought medical help, suffering in silence for years afterward. The international scope of rail riding practices reveals disturbing parallels across cultures and time periods. In Tsarist Russia, a similar punishment called the mare was used against political prisoners and rebellious serfs. Japanese military forces during the Second Sino-Japanese War employed a variant using bamboo rails, which would splinter and embed themselves in the victim's flesh. In the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, colonial administrators used rail riding as a punishment for rubber quota violations, with documented cases of entire families being forced to watch as the head of household was tortured. These global variations suggest that the human imagination for cruelty operates along disturbingly similar lines, regardless of cultural context. The role of medical professionals in both perpetrating and opposing rail riding presents a complex ethical study. Some military surgeons actively participated by advising on how to prolong suffering without causing immediate death, betraying their Hippocratic oaths in service of military discipline. Others risked their careers and lives by refusing to revive unconscious victims or by providing medical testimony about the barbarity of the practice. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor for her service as a Civil War surgeon, wrote extensively about treating rail riding victims and became a vocal advocate for abolishing the practice. Her medical reports, which detailed the permanent disabilities inflicted, were instrumental in turning military opinion against the punishment. The transformation of rail riding from an official punishment to a tool of vigilante justice marked a dark chapter in American history during the Reconstruction era. As federal troops withdrew from the South and local power structures reformed, the rail became a weapon of racial terrorism and political intimidation. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups adopted the practice as part of their campaign to suppress black political participation and maintain white supremacy. The mobility of the rail, any fence could become an instrument of torture, made it particularly suited to the hit-and-run tactics of night riders who would appear at homes, conduct their brutal business, and disappear before authorities could respond. The case of Samuel Johnson, a black legislator in Mississippi, illustrates the political weaponization of rail riding during Reconstruction. In 1871, Johnson was dragged from his home by masked men who subjected him to 2 hours on a rail while demanding he resign his elected position. Johnson survived but was permanently disabled, unable to walk without assistance for the rest of his life. His testimony before Congress helped document the systematic use of torture to undermine black political power, though it resulted in little meaningful federal intervention. Hundreds of similar cases went unreported, as victims feared that speaking out would only invite further violence against themselves and their families. Labor disputes in the rapidly industrializing North also saw the adoption of rail riding as a tool of intimidation. During the 1877 Great Railroad Strike, Company guards and Pinkerton agents were documented using the punishment against suspected union organizers. The irony of railroad workers being tortured on rails was not lost on contemporary observers. In mining camps across the West, claim jumpers and suspected thieves faced vigilante justice that often included rail riding, with the remoteness of these locations ensuring that no legal consequences would follow. The practice became so associated with frontier justice that the phrase "riding someone out of town on a rail" entered common parlance, though its sanitized usage obscured the brutal reality. International observers were horrified by the persistence of such practices in a nation that proclaimed itself a beacon of democracy and human rights. British journalist William Howard Russell, who had covered the Crimean War and Indian Rebellion, wrote that the scenes he witnessed in the American South rivaled anything he had seen in declared war zones. French diplomat Gustave de Beaumont noted that the American tolerance for vigilante justice, including rail riding, represented a fundamental contradiction in a society that claimed to be governed by law. These international critiques contributed to diplomatic pressure on the American government to address the issue, though domestic political considerations often outweighed international opinion. The legal framework surrounding rail riding reveals the inadequacy of 19th-century justice systems in addressing torture. While most states had laws against assault and battery, prosecutors rarely pursued cases involving rail riding, particularly when the victims were marginalized individuals. The few cases that did reach trial often resulted in acquittals, as juries drawn from the same communities that sanctioned the violence were unlikely to convict. Even when convictions were obtained, sentences were typically light, fines or short jail terms that hardly reflected the severity of the injuries inflicted. This legal failure created a de facto endorsement of the practice, suggesting that some citizens existed outside the protection of the law. Religious institutions played a contradictory role in the history of rail riding, with some clergy condemning the practice while others provided theological justification. Certain fundamentalist preachers argued that severe physical punishment was biblically sanctioned, citing Old Testament passages about the wages of sin. Others, particularly Quakers and Methodists, became vocal opponents, organizing medical care for victims and lobbying for legal reforms. The Reverend Henry McNeil Turner, a prominent African Methodist Episcopal bishop, delivered sermons comparing rail riding to the crucifixion, arguing that those who inflicted such tortures were committing blasphemy against the image of God in man. The gradual medical understanding of infection and sepsis in the late 19th century added another dimension to the horror of rail riding. Doctors began to recognize that many victims who survived the initial torture died weeks later from infections that entered through the wounds. The unsanitary conditions of most rails, exposed to weather, animal waste, and dirt, meant that even relatively short exposures could result in fatal infections. The development of germ theory led some medical professionals to argue that rail riding constituted a form of biological warfare, deliberately exposing victims to pathogens through open wounds. This medical testimony proved crucial in finally turning public opinion against the practice. The economic arguments against rail riding, particularly in industrial settings, eventually proved more persuasive than moral ones to many in positions of power. Factory owners and mining companies began to realize that permanently injuring workers reduced their available labor force and could lead to costly compensation claims. Insurance companies started refusing to cover businesses that were known to permit or encourage such practices. The rise of organized labor unions, despite facing severe repression, managed to publicize cases of rail riding to generate public sympathy and support for their cause. Strike-breaking agencies found that the use of such extreme measures could backfire, generating more support for workers than traditional strike-breaking tactics. The psychological profiles of those who administered rail riding punishments reveal disturbing insights into the nature of human cruelty and the conditions that enable it. Military records and court testimonies provide glimpses into the mindsets of individuals who could inflict such tortures on their fellow human beings. Many perpetrators justified their actions through dehumanization of victims, viewing them as less than fully human and therefore not deserving of basic human consideration. Others exhibited what modern psychologists would recognize as sadistic personality traits, deriving pleasure from the suffering they inflicted. The group dynamics that enabled rail riding, peer pressure, diffusion of responsibility, and normalization of violence mirror patterns seen in other historical atrocities. The role of spectators in rail riding events presents a troubling study in collective moral failure. Crowds would gather to watch these punishments, creating a carnival-like atmosphere around human suffering. Some spectators would jeer and mock victims, while others stood in silent complicity. The few who attempted to intervene often faced violence themselves, creating a culture of fear that perpetuated the practice. Children were sometimes brought to watch, with parents claiming it would teach them moral lessons about the consequences of wrongdoing. The long-term psychological effects on these young witnesses, nightmares, anxiety, and normalized violence, created generational trauma that rippled through communities for decades. The intersection of rail riding with American concepts of masculinity reveals how gender norms were weaponized to enhance torture. Male victims faced particular humiliation as the punishment attacked both their physical strength and sexual identity. The damage to sexual organs was not incidental, but often deliberately maximized to emasculate victims in the eyes of their community. Surviving rail riding while maintaining composure became a perverse test of manhood, with some men refusing to cry out despite excruciating pain. This toxic convergence of torture and gender performance created additional psychological burdens for survivors, who struggled with feelings of shame and inadequacy long after physical wounds had healed. Women who witnessed rail riding, particularly the wives and mothers of victims, left poignant accounts of secondary trauma. Mary Chen, whose husband was subjected to rail riding during anti-Chinese riots in California, described how she could never forget the sound of his screams or the sight of his broken body afterward. She spent years caring for his injuries and dealing with his psychological deterioration, effectively becoming a secondary victim of the torture. Women's organizations, particularly the Women's Christian Temperance Union, began documenting these family impacts, arguing that rail riding destroyed entire households, not just individual victims. The use of rail riding against children and adolescents represents perhaps the darkest aspect of this practice. Reformatories and industrial schools in the late 19th century employed modified versions of rail riding as discipline for orphans and juvenile delinquents. Boys as young as 12 were subjected to shortened sessions on the rail for offenses like running away or stealing food. The developmental damage, both physical and psychological, was catastrophic, with many victims never achieving normal growth or emotional development. Survivors of these juvenile institutions later testified about the lifelong impacts, including chronic pain, sexual dysfunction, and severe post-traumatic stress that manifested in substance abuse, violence, and suicide. The medicalization of sadism in the late 19th century led some practitioners to attempt scientific justifications for rail riding. Pseudoscientific theories about pain as a corrective force, influenced by social Darwinism, suggested that severe physical punishment could reform criminal tendencies by literally reshaping the nervous system. Some asylum directors employed rail riding as a supposed treatment for mental illness, believing that extreme physical stress could shock patients back to sanity. These medical atrocities, conducted under the guise of treatment, produced no therapeutic benefits, while causing immense suffering and permanent injury to already vulnerable individuals. International humanitarian movements began to focus on American rail riding practices as part of broader campaigns against torture. The International Red Cross, though primarily concerned with military conflicts, documented cases of rail riding in American military camps and published reports that embarrassed American diplomats. British and French abolitionists who had fought against slavery pointed out the continuation of torture practices in post-Civil War America as evidence that true freedom had not been achieved. These international pressures, combined with domestic reform movements, gradually built momentum for legal and social changes that would eventually eliminate official sanction for such practices. The technological and industrial changes of the late 19th century inadvertently contributed to the decline of rail riding. The replacement of wooden rail fences with wire fencing removed the readily available instruments of torture from many communities. Urbanization meant that the public spectacles associated with frontier justice became less socially acceptable in city settings. The professionalization of police forces and the establishment of formal criminal justice systems, though far from perfect, provided alternatives to vigilante punishment. Photography also played a role as images of rail riding victims began to circulate, making it harder for communities to ignore or deny the brutality of the practice. The legacy of rail riding in American collective memory has been largely suppressed, relegated to euphemistic phrases and sanitized historical accounts. The expression "ridden out of town on a rail" has become divorced from its violent origins, used casually to describe political defeats or social embarrassments. This linguistic sanitization represents a broader pattern of historical amnesia about American torture practices. Museums and historical sites rarely mention rail riding, even when discussing frontier justice or Civil War military discipline. Textbooks, when they reference the practice at all, often minimize its severity or frequency, treating it as an unfortunate but minor historical footnote rather than a systematic tool of oppression and control. The survivors of rail riding and their descendants carried invisible wounds that influenced American society in subtle but profound ways. Families affected by the practice often experienced intergenerational trauma, with children of victims showing higher rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. Communities where rail riding was common developed cultures of silence around physical and sexual violence, patterns that persisted long after the practice itself ended. The medical needs of survivors strained early social welfare systems, contributing to debates about veteran care, disability support, and the obligations of society to those harmed by sanctioned violence. Legal scholarship on rail riding has revealed important precedents in American jurisprudence regarding cruel and unusual punishment. Though the Eighth Amendment existed throughout the period when rail riding was common, courts rarely applied its protections to extrajudicial punishments or military discipline. The eventual recognition that rail riding violated constitutional principles helped establish broader interpretations of human rights protections, though this evolution came too late for thousands of victims. Modern legal scholars point to the rail riding era as a cautionary tale about the gap between constitutional principles and their actual enforcement, particularly for marginalized populations. The comparison between historical rail riding and modern enhanced interrogation techniques reveals disturbing parallels in how societies justify torture. The arguments used to defend rail riding, that it was necessary for maintaining order, that it was more humane than alternatives, that victims were enemies who deserved harsh treatment, echo contemporary debates about torture. The medical involvement in calibrating suffering to avoid death while maximizing pain presaged similar ethical violations in modern state-sanctioned torture programs. Understanding the historical trajectory from rail riding to current practices illuminates how torture persists despite legal and moral prohibitions. Psychological research on perpetrators and bystanders of rail riding has contributed to our understanding of how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary cruelty. The Stanford prison experiment and Milgram obedience studies of the 1960s and 1970s found parallels between their laboratory observations and historical accounts of rail riding events. The diffusion of responsibility in group settings, the power of authority figures to compel participation in violence, and the rapid breakdown of moral boundaries under certain conditions all featured prominently in rail riding scenarios. This research has informed modern military training on preventing torture and war crimes, though implementation remains imperfect. The racial dimensions of rail riding history connect to ongoing struggles for racial justice in America. The use of rail riding as a tool of racial terrorism during Reconstruction established patterns of violence that persisted through the Jim Crow era and beyond. Communities where rail riding was used to suppress black political participation showed continued patterns of voter suppression and racial violence well into the 20th century. Modern racial justice movements have occasionally referenced rail riding as part of the historical continuum of anti-black violence, though the practice remains less well known than lynching or other forms of racial terrorism. Feminist historians have uncovered the gendered dimensions of rail riding that were long ignored in mainstream historical accounts. The sexual nature of injuries inflicted by rail riding made it a particularly potent tool for controlling women's behavior and sexuality. Women who challenged social norms, whether through political activism, sexual autonomy, or economic independence, faced the threat of rail riding as a specifically gendered punishment. The silence around women's experiences of rail riding reflected broader patterns of minimizing or ignoring sexual violence in historical narratives. Recent scholarship has attempted to recover these lost stories, though many records were deliberately destroyed or never created. The international human rights implications of America's rail riding history continue to resonate in diplomatic contexts. When the United States criticizes other nations for human rights violations, historians and diplomats from those countries sometimes reference America's own history of torture, including rail riding. This historical burden complicates American moral authority in international forums, requiring acknowledgement of past failures while advocating for current human rights standards. The evolution from a society that tolerated rail riding to one that officially opposes torture worldwide represents both progress and an ongoing struggle with historical accountability. The medical documentation of rail riding injuries has contributed significantly to modern understanding of trauma medicine and pain management. Physicians studying historical accounts of rail riding victims identified patterns of nerve damage that informed early neurological research. The descriptions of chronic pain syndromes in rail riding survivors helped establish pain as a legitimate medical condition deserving of treatment, rather than simply a moral failing or character weakness. Modern pain management techniques, including nerve blocks and surgical interventions, can trace some of their development to attempts to treat rail riding survivors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The intersection of rail riding with American religious and moral philosophy reveals fundamental tensions in how society balances justice and mercy. Religious leaders who opposed rail riding developed sophisticated theological arguments about the nature of human dignity and the limits of earthly punishment. These arguments influenced broader American debates about criminal justice reform, the death penalty, and the purposes of incarceration. Conversely, those who used religious justifications for rail riding contributed to a strain of American religious thought that sees suffering as redemptive and severe punishment as divinely sanctioned. These competing theological visions continue to influence American approaches to criminal justice and punishment. The economic history of rail riding reveals how torture functioned within capitalist systems of labor control. The threat of rail riding served to discipline workers, suppress wages, and prevent organization. The practice was most common in industries with high labor turnover and dangerous working conditions, where employers sought to maintain control through fear rather than improved conditions or compensation. The eventual abandonment of such extreme measures coincided with the recognition that more subtle forms of labor control, blacklists, company towns, and economic dependency could achieve similar results without the public relations problems associated with visible torture. Cultural productions dealing with rail riding, novels, plays, and eventually films, have shaped public memory of the practice while often distorting its reality. Early dime novels sensationalized rail riding as part of Wild West mythology, transforming torture into entertainment. Later literary works, particularly those by Southern Gothic writers, used rail riding as a metaphor for American violence and moral failure. The absence of rail riding from most Hollywood westerns and Civil War films reflects deliberate choices to sanitize American history for mass consumption. When the practice does appear in cultural productions, it is often minimized or played for dark humor rather than treated with appropriate gravity. The pedagogical challenges of teaching about rail riding in contemporary educational settings reflect broader difficulties in addressing historical trauma. Educators must balance the need for historical accuracy with age-appropriate content and sensitivity to traumatized communities. The graphic nature of rail riding makes it difficult to discuss in many educational contexts, leading to its omission from most curricula. When it is taught, educators often struggle to help students understand how ordinary people could participate in or tolerate such cruelty. These pedagogical challenges mirror those faced when teaching about other historical atrocities, requiring careful consideration of how to convey difficult truths while maintaining educational objectives. The forensic archaeology of rail riding sites has provided material evidence supporting survivor testimonies previously dismissed as exaggeration. Excavations at Civil War camps and frontier towns have uncovered modified rails with evidence of blood, tissue, and other biological materials. These findings corroborate written accounts and provide tangible proof of the practice's widespread use. The preservation and interpretation of these sites raises ethical questions about how to memorialize spaces of torture while respecting victim dignity and preventing glorification of violence. Some communities have chosen to acknowledge these histories through historical markers, while others prefer to leave the past buried. The comparative study of rail riding with other historical torture methods reveals universal patterns in how humans inflict suffering. The simplicity of the implement, the use of the victim's own body weight as the source of pain, and the combination of physical and psychological torture appear across cultures and time periods. This universality suggests that certain forms of cruelty emerge independently when social conditions permit, rather than spreading through cultural transmission. Understanding these patterns may help identify and prevent the emergence of new torture practices in contemporary contexts. The role of rail riding in American military culture influenced training and discipline practices long after the punishment itself was abandoned. The emphasis on physical endurance, pain tolerance, and breaking down individual will that characterized rail riding found new expressions in military training regimens. While modern military training is regulated and monitored to prevent abuse, elements of the rail riding mentality, that extreme physical stress builds character and ensures compliance, persist in some quarters. Veterans of various eras have drawn connections between their training experiences and historical accounts of rail riding, suggesting continuities in how military institutions approach human endurance and suffering. The transnational networks that opposed rail riding in the 19th century pioneered strategies later used by international human rights organizations. Activists shared information across borders, published expose articles in multiple languages, and coordinated diplomatic pressure on the American government. These early human rights campaigns established precedents for international intervention in domestic human rights abuses. The success and failures of anti-rail riding activism informed later campaigns against lynching, prison abuse, and other forms of state-sanctioned or tolerated violence. The organizational structures and tactics developed during this period laid groundwork for 20th century human rights movements. The psychiatric treatment of rail riding survivors contributed to early developments in trauma therapy. Physicians observed that traditional treatments for physical injuries were insufficient when patients continued to experience pain and disability long after tissues had healed. This led to early recognition of what would later be termed psychosomatic illness and post-traumatic stress. Treatment approaches developed for rail riding survivors, including talk therapy, occupational therapy, and gradual exposure to triggering stimuli, presaged modern trauma-informed care. The high rate of suicide among survivors also contributed to early psychiatric understanding of trauma-related suicidal ideation. The insurance and actuarial implications of rail riding injuries influenced the development of American disability and workers' compensation systems. Insurance companies, attempting to calculate risks and compensation for rail riding injuries, developed some of the first systematic approaches to evaluating permanent disability. The long-term care needs of survivors, forced consideration of lifetime disability costs, and family support needs. These economic calculations eventually made rail riding financially untenable for many institutions, contributing to its decline. The actuarial data collected during this period provided early evidence for the economic arguments against torture that continue to be made today. The linguistic evolution of terms related to rail riding reflects changing social attitudes toward torture and violence. Medical terminology shifted from euphemistic phrases like disciplinary injuries to more clinical descriptions acknowledging torture. Legal language evolved from treating rail riding as a form of correction to recognizing it as assault or torture. Vernacular expressions moved from casual acceptance to recognition of brutality. This linguistic evolution both reflected and contributed to changing social norms around acceptable forms of punishment and violence. Contemporary efforts to accurately name and describe torture practices draw on lessons learned from the linguistic sanitization of rail riding. The gender studies perspective on rail riding reveals how torture practices reinforce and challenge gender norms. Male victims faced emasculation through sexual injury and public humiliation, while female victims experienced specifically gendered forms of sexual torture. The perpetrators of rail riding were almost exclusively male, reinforcing associations between masculinity and violence. Women who opposed the practice were often dismissed as overly emotional or naive about the necessities of frontier justice. These gendered dynamics influenced how rail riding was recorded, remembered, and eventually abandoned. Modern feminist scholars argue that understanding these dynamics is crucial for recognizing and preventing contemporary forms of gendered violence. The environmental history of rail riding connects the practice to broader patterns of resource use and landscape transformation in American history. The wooden rails used for torture were typically taken from the same fences that divided and claimed land during westward expansion. The deforestation that provided materials for rails was part of the same environmental destruction that displaced indigenous peoples and transformed ecosystems. The eventual replacement of wooden rails with wire fencing represented both technological progress and the removal of readily available torture implements. This environmental dimension suggests that torture practices are embedded in broader systems of resource extraction and environmental domination. The disability rights perspective on rail riding survivors has influenced modern understanding of torture rehabilitation. Many survivors lived with permanent disabilities, requiring lifelong accommodation and support. Their experiences challenged 19th-century notions of disability as moral failing or divine punishment, instead revealing disability as a consequence of human cruelty. The advocacy of rail riding survivors for medical care, financial support, and social accommodation contributed to early disability rights consciousness. Modern torture rehabilitation programs draw on lessons learned from attempts to support rail riding survivors, though resources remain inadequate for addressing the full scope of torture's long-term impacts. The archival challenges of documenting rail riding reflect broader issues in preserving evidence of historical atrocities. Many records were deliberately destroyed to protect perpetrators or avoid shame. Survivor testimonies were often dismissed or suppressed. Medical records used euphemistic language that obscured the true nature of injuries. Recovering this history has required innovative archival methods, including oral history collection, archaeological investigation, and reinterpretation of coded language in official documents. These archival challenges mirror those faced in documenting other historical atrocities and highlight the importance of preserving and protecting evidence of human rights abuses. The contemporary relevance of rail riding history extends beyond historical curiosity to inform current debates about punishment, torture, and human rights. The arguments used to justify rail riding, emergency circumstances, the need to maintain order, the supposed lesser evil compared to death, continue to appear in modern justifications for enhanced interrogation and harsh prison conditions. The failure of legal systems to prevent or punish rail riding, despite existing laws against cruel punishment, parallels modern challenges in enforcing human rights protections. The role of medical professionals in facilitating and opposing rail riding provides lessons for contemporary medical ethics in military and carceral settings. The memorialization debates surrounding rail riding sites reflect broader challenges in how societies remember and interpret violent histories. Some communities have erected monuments to rail riding victims, while others resist acknowledging this history. The question of how to memorialize torture sites without glorifying violence or re-traumatizing survivors and descendants remains contentious. Some argue for preservation and education, while others prefer to let physical reminders disappear. These debates mirror those surrounding Confederate monuments, Japanese internment camps, and other sites of historical injustice, revealing ongoing struggles with historical accountability and public memory. The reparative justice implications of rail riding history raise questions about intergenerational responsibility and redress. Descendants of rail riding victims have occasionally sought recognition and compensation for their ancestors' suffering, though legal mechanisms for such redress are limited. Communities that enrich themselves through industries that employed rail riding face questions about acknowledging and addressing these historical injustices. The lack of comprehensive documentation makes identifying victims and perpetrators challenging, complicating efforts at historical justice. These challenges inform contemporary discussions about reparations for slavery, indigenous genocide, and other historical injustices. The educational mandate to teach about rail riding and similar practices faces resistance from those who prefer sanitized versions of history. Arguments that such content is too disturbing for students or that it unfairly criticizes American history echo broader debates about critical race theory and honest history education. Educators who include rail riding in their curricula risk backlash from parents and administrators uncomfortable with confronting American violence, Yet excluding such history perpetuates ignorance about the capacity for cruelty and the conditions that enable it. The pedagogical challenge lies in presenting difficult history in ways that promote understanding and prevention rather than trauma or nihilism. The international humanitarian law implications of America's rail riding history influence contemporary legal frameworks around torture. The documentation of rail riding practices contributed to the development of international agreements defining and prohibiting torture. American diplomats negotiating human rights treaties must contend with this historical record when advocating for strong anti-torture provisions. The evolution from a society that practiced rail riding to one that officially opposes torture provides both inspiration and cautionary lessons for other nations grappling with their own histories of state-sanctioned violence. The psychological research on resilience and recovery among rail riding survivors has informed modern trauma treatment approaches. Some survivors demonstrated remarkable resilience, rebuilding their lives despite permanent injuries and psychological trauma. Studying their coping mechanisms has contributed to understanding of post-traumatic growth and resilience factors. Family support, community acceptance, and meaning-making processes appeared crucial for recovery. These insights inform contemporary treatment approaches for torture survivors, though the unique cultural and historical contexts of rail riding limit direct application to modern cases. The cultural trauma inflicted by rail riding on entire communities extends beyond individual victims to shape collective identities and social relations. Communities where rail riding was common developed cultures of silence, fear, and complicity that persisted for generations. The normalization of extreme violence affected how these communities approached conflict resolution, child discipline, and social control. Recovering from this cultural trauma has required deliberate efforts at truth-telling, reconciliation, and cultural transformation. These processes provide models and cautionary tales for other communities attempting to address histories of collective violence. The final decline of rail riding as an accepted practice resulted from a convergence of factors rather than any single decisive change. Legal reforms gradually strengthened enforcement of existing prohibitions. Medical testimony made the consequences of the practice undeniable. Economic calculations revealed its counterproductive nature. International pressure embarrassed American leaders. Cultural shifts made public torture socially unacceptable. Technological changes removed the implements of torture from common availability. This multifactored decline suggests that ending torture practices requires comprehensive approaches addressing legal, medical, economic, social, and cultural dimensions. The last documented cases of rail riding in the United States occurred in the early 20th century, though the practice likely continued unreported in some isolated communities for years afterward. The transition from widespread acceptance to universal condemnation took decades and was neither smooth nor complete. Some communities abandoned the practice early, horrified by its brutality, while others clung to it as a symbol of frontier justice and traditional values. The generational divide between those who had witnessed or participated in rail riding and those who knew it only as history created complex family dynamics and community tensions that persist in subtle ways today. The transformation of American society that finally ended rail riding required fundamental changes in how Americans understood justice, punishment, and human dignity. The progressive era's emphasis on scientific approaches to social problems challenged the crude brutality of rail riding. The growth of professional police forces and formal criminal justice systems provided alternatives to vigilante justice. The expansion of federal power made it harder for local communities to operate outside legal constraints. The gradual inclusion of marginalized groups in the protection of law reduced the population available for consequence-free torture. These changes were neither inevitable nor irreversible, requiring constant vigilance to maintain. The survivors of rail riding who lived into the 20th century became reluctant witnesses to a changing world. Some found vindication in the eventual recognition that what they had endured was torture rather than legitimate punishment. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to revisit their trauma, even as society evolved to acknowledge its wrongness. The last known rail riding survivor, James Patterson, died in 1967 at the age of 102, taking with him memories of an America that had sanctioned his torture as a young man for the crime of stealing food during the Depression. His death marked the end of living memory of the practice, transforming it from contemporary issue to historical artifact. The lessons of rail riding for contemporary human rights work are both sobering and essential. The practice demonstrates how quickly societies can normalize extreme violence when certain conditions align: dehumanization of victims, diffusion of responsibility, absence of accountability, and social sanction of violence. It reveals how torture persists not through dramatic evil, but through mundane participation and passive acceptance. It shows how legal prohibitions alone are insufficient without cultural change and enforcement mechanisms. Most critically, it demonstrates that progress away from torture is neither inevitable nor permanent, requiring constant vigilance against the conditions that enable such practices. The global persistence of torture practices similar to rail riding reminds us that this history is not merely academic. Contemporary reports from conflict zones and authoritarian regimes describe torture methods that echo rail riding in their use of simple implements, body weight, and prolonged suffering. The same justifications appear: maintaining order, extracting information, punishing enemies. The same patterns of denial and minimization occur. Understanding the history of rail riding provides tools for recognizing and opposing contemporary torture, though knowledge alone is insufficient without the will to act against injustice. The obligation to remember rail riding and similar practices stems not from fascination with cruelty, but from recognition that forgetting enables repetition. Each generation must decide anew whether to permit or prevent torture, and historical amnesia makes the wrong choice more likely. The sanitization of rail riding in popular memory, reduced to a cartoonish image of someone bounced out of town, represents a dangerous forgetting that obscures the human capacity for cruelty and the conditions that unleash it. Accurate historical memory serves as a warning and a call to vigilance against the ever-present possibility of torture's return. The story of rail riding ultimately challenges comfortable narratives about American history and human nature. It forces confrontation with the fact that ordinary people in familiar communities chose to inflict extraordinary suffering on their fellow humans. It reveals that progress away from barbarism is neither linear nor guaranteed. It demonstrates that torture emerges not from individual pathology alone, but from social systems that enable and encourage cruelty. These uncomfortable truths are precisely why the history must be preserved and taught, despite the discomfort it causes. As we conclude this examination of rail riding, we must resist the temptation to see it as an aberration, or to distance ourselves from those who perpetrated and tolerated it. The same human psychology that enabled rail riding exists today, constrained by different social norms and legal structures, but not eliminated. The price of preventing torture's return is eternal vigilance against the conditions that enable it: dehumanization, lawlessness, and the normalization of violence. The victims of rail riding cannot be restored to wholeness, but their suffering can serve as a warning to future generations about the depths of cruelty that lurk beneath civilization's thin veneer. In remembering their agony, we commit ourselves to never allowing such darkness to resurface in our time.